And good evening from Philadelphia. Frank here with yet another episode, a quarantine episode of UFO News Network Sunday. We've got a special guest for you this evening, and let me go over to my co-host to introduce him, Chant Hanna, as always. Chant, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well, Frank. Thank you so much. We have a wonderful person on the show tonight. He's an iconic researcher. Everybody knows him. He's also a dear friend of both of ours, Paul Dean. I'd like to go ahead and just give a longer bio for him because, he's done quite a lot of work regarding the topic of ufology and other topics that are meaningful to all of us. Paul Dean is an Australian researcher who focuses on government and military involvement and response to the so-called UFO phenomena. Working alone for 20 years, Paul became an expert in regards to so-called UFO files. 6 years ago, he began tackling the problem directly and became instrumental in seeing that the Australian government released classified files from the Royal Australian Air Force, Air Services Australia, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, and the National Archives of Australia. He works extensively with Australian-based researcher Keith Basterfield on UFO case analysis and the preservation of UFO-related records. Paul Dean and his team use the Freedom of Information Act, FOIAs, to obtain records and is hot on the trail of hundreds of never-before-seen classified military files. Recent discoveries include UFO sighting, reports created during the Vietnam War, and administrative records related to a pair of highly classified UFO tracking programs, which were ran by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force during America's involvement in Vietnam. Other fresh finds include Federal Bureau of Investigation records related to the interrogation of UFO researchers in the 70s and a current Federal Aviation Administration system for logging military intercepts of unknown objects in America's airspace. Paul has also begun requesting UFO records from the U.S. Air Force's Space Command, which will include files from the 21st Space Wing and the Vital Joint Functional Component Center for Space at Vandenberg Air Force Base, working on a daily basis with Boston-based archivist and historian Barry Greenwood. Paul believes there are likely hundreds of thousands of UFO records still held by elements of the U.S. government and works tirelessly to source their location and availability status. All in all, Paul has acquired a total of 240,000 pages of UFO-related government and military records from around the world and tens of millions of pages of non-government UFO records, including books, newsletters, monographs, newspaper articles, case studies, letters, and magazine articles. Paul, welcome to our show. Again, we've had you on many times and we enjoy having you. Thank you for being on the show tonight.
Thank you, Chant. I look forward to it.
Wanted to ask you about a little bit about the definitive history regarding the ballistic missile early warning system. Could you please cover that topic? I know it goes from the U.S. to the U.K. Maybe gloss over that with us for a little bit.
Yeah. So one thing that UFO researchers don't do anywhere near enough of is study the operational capacity and capability and history of the actual sites, like the actual sites and systems and facilities and squadrons and battalions and whatever that are responsible for aerospace detection and tracking of objects in the atmosphere and space, verification of real objects versus like fake returns or radar clutter or whatever. And one of the most potent and capable and legacy systems we have to look at, period, is it's a system called the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, and it was developed by the 9th Aerospace. The 9th Aerospace Division, the NORAD Missile Warning Center, the old Aerospace Defense Command's missile warning cells, and various universities and think tanks. And what it is, it's a tri-site. That's 3 sites around the world. One is in Clear in Alaska. The second one is in Thule at Thule Air Station in Greenland, and the third site is actually on the east coast of England in North Yorkshire. And these three sites, what their job is, what their job has always been since the early 60s, is to these three sites have a primary mission and a secondary mission. The primary mission is missile warning, or missile launch warning, or missile detection and tracking and impact prediction and so on. And what being all in the northern hemisphere, what these three facilities do up until today, still now, is they have these unbelievably powerful radars, these synthetic aperture track while scan radars that can see, for want of a better word, at 3,000 miles into space on a pretty sharp angle. And what they're looking for in primary mode, what they've always looked for is missiles, like as in nuclear missiles, and not just one, but they can track as many as 200 or 300 at a time. They're looking for missiles that have originated from the oceans, like from submarines or ships around the old Soviet Union or current Russia, and they're looking for intercontinental ballistic missiles which have originated from northern China, central Russia, northern Russia, back in the old days, maybe East Germany or Poland. So basically, their primary mission is to constantly search the skies 24 hours a day, looking for objects which fit the parameters of missiles. That's fast-moving, independent, non-maneuverable objects that come up from the ground at shallow angles, means perpendicular to Earth's surface, and then make a bit of a right-hand turn and head towards England, Scotland, the United States, or Canada. So this is frontline missile warning. Like this is as soon as an object is detected that fits the parameters of a missile, these three sites in Alaska, Greenland, and England, they automatically send data to over the years the Aerospace Defense Command or the Air Force.
Paul, you're breaking up a little bit, but just to jump in really quick, basically, that was in the back during the. Go ahead. You're breaking up, Paul.
Yeah, back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay? I can hear you now. But I was just telling the folks that really the reason why they're located in such northern latitudes is because basically that's the shortest path for missiles to get from the old Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's correct. So. So Soviet and Polish missiles that are heading over the poles to Canada or the United States or Scotland, we want to detect them. There's no point having the facility down in Antarctica. These sites are responsible for missile warning for North America and Western Europe, and that's in primary mode. Their secondary, these radar systems are so powerful that they have a secondary capability. It's called space surveillance, and that simply means the detection, tracking, and identification of objects in low Earth orbit. So that's satellite junk, rocket boosters, the odd asteroid, whatever. So basically, the Thule, Clear, and Farlingdale site, the latter one, Farlingdale's in England, their job is in primary mode is missile warning, and in secondary mode is to detect and track satellites which should conform to the satellite or space object catalogue. And every now and again, they will pick up a new object in space that they've never seen before, might be part of a new foreign launch, or it might be a piece of space debris that's broken off from another piece of space debris that they've never tagged or classified before. But so basically, these three sites look north over the poles, just looking for anything that's in the upper atmosphere and out into space. That's basically what they do. Yeah.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much for having covered that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about an interesting situation that occurred to you while you were actually requesting information from the UK. We talked about this a little earlier before the show. It sounds like you were actually kind of fighting with them, I use that term loosely, by the way, with the British government on the topic of the ballistic missile early warning system. And when you actually FOIA'd them, you asked them specifically about that topic, and then they came back bizarrely denying you on that. But the bizarre part was that they touched on the topic of UFOs and the ET topic. Can you please fill us in on that?
Yeah, now this was bizarre. I have been studying space object and missile object and atmospheric detection issues for 20 years, and so obviously one of the best places to go is the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. Now in America, the sites in Alaska and Greenland are run by the 13th and 12th Missile Warning Squadron, respectively. But England's a bit different. So England, being an international site between the US Air Force and England's Royal Air Force, England's Ballistic Missile Early Warning System site, which is called RAF Fylingdales, huge place. It reports administratively to the Royal Air Force of the British Ministry of Defence, Air Force Space Command headquarters, and in England, data is supplied to the Space Warning Service and various other cells within England. So this is truly an international site. The reason I wanted to ask the RAF Fylingdales, I wanted to ask someone, whether it be the US Air Force or the Royal Air Force in England, for material like reports and electronic forms about object detection. And now I had two choices. I could go to the US Air Force for RAF Fylingdales material, or I could go to the British Ministry of Defence for RAF Fylingdales material. The reason I picked the Ministry of Defence is because their FOI department, their Freedom of Information Request department, is very streamlined. It's quick. They're honest. They don't lose FOI requests like the Americans do. So what I did, I went to in June 2017, I went to the British Ministry of Defence, and I asked, and I'll read out my actual request, right? I asked for copies of records related to the detection of RAF Fylingdales. Specifically, I wish to be furnished with copies of actual detections and trackings, which may include electronic forms, electronic reports, automated pictorials, etc., which are created by the systems at RAF Fylingdales. Blah blah blah. Now, I got an acknowledgement at the end of that month from the British Ministry of Defence, their information rights team. Later, on the 5th of July 2017, so about a month after I submitted my FOI request, I got an email, a substantive email from Air Command Secretariat of the Royal Air Force Air Command Headquarters, and most of what it said. It said, I have searched our records for the information and I can confirm that the Ministry of Defence holds information in the scope of your request. Information relates to matters pertinent to the defence of the United Kingdom and not to any so-called extraterrestrial life. Then it goes on discussing how many got with retrieving data and so on, and then it says, I'm writing to advise you that it would take considerably longer than 3.5 working days to provide you with information, blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately, in this instance, I am unable to offer you any advice on how you may refine your request in a way that would enable the MOD to provide you with a response. And then it goes on with more administrative stuff. Anyway, finally, it says, as you would expect, the MOD has a responsibility to use defence resources, including those available to us at RAF Fylingdales, only for activities which contribute to the defence and security of the UK. The department has no opinion on the existence or otherwise of extraterrestrial life. The MOD continues to receive correspondence from members of the public concerning UFO sightings. The MOD does not investigate these. So this is incredible because I specifically asked for copies of records related to the detection of unknown, unidentified and unsolved objects at Fylingdales, which would include copies of actual detections and trackings, electronic forms, reports, automated pictorials that have been created by the systems at RAF Fylingdales. And like I said, their reply first mentions that Farlingdales is all to do with defence of the United Kingdom and not to do with extraterrestrial life, and then in the last paragraph they mentioned UFO sightings and again extraterrestrial life, and I've never seen that before. I've never seen. I mean, I can only assume that they have received requests like this before, that kind of flog the UFO angle or the ET angle, but I certainly didn't ask for that. So that was certainly very unusual.
When you read that, did your jaw drop and did you laugh?
Yes, I sort of thought to myself, hold on. I sort of had to go back to my original FOI request and think, because I mean, I knew I hadn't asked about ET or aliens or UFO sightings or UFO records as such. I mean, yes, it is true that the RAF Farlingdales' ballistic missile early warning system radar on computers. It is true that they do pick up. Their job is to pick up unidentified flying objects in a sense, but that I never included that radioactive term in that toxic sort of term in my FOI request, and I certainly didn't talk about extraterrestrial life. I was quite stunned. I can only think up as an FOI requester, which I'm quite prolific, or they have simply assumed, oh shit, this guy, he wants UFO information or ET records or something like that. But yeah, I was very surprised, because usually the Ministry of Defence are very, very straight down the line. They're very specific. They're very they dot their I's and cross their T's. I've never seen the Ministry of Defence make such an assumption like this. I was quite surprised. Yeah.
By the way, I just want to thank you for having gone over SOI, the Space Object Identification, which can measure anything in space regarding the length, the width, the right eye cross-section return, the brightness, the tumbling motions, and this all helps to identify what the object is regarding space objects. Do you have any more on that topic you wanted to cover?
Heaps. I mean, okay, so this is something really, really important for UFO research. So space object identification, it's a theory. It's a term used by the US Air Force's Space Command and the 14th Air Force and the old Air Defence Command and Aerospace Defence Command and the British Royal Air Force and so on. What SOI is, space object identification, is any number of the sites, whether it's the ballistic missile early warning system sites or the ground electro-optical deep surveillance system sites or the naval space surveillance fence in America, whatever, when they detect an object in space, be it a missile warhead or missile warheads plural or satellite, their systems, their actual computer systems, can perform something called space object identification, or SOI. And that means that the computer systems look at the characteristics of the imaging or the radar returns. They're looking for radar reflectivity or optical reflectivity, like how bright the object is in either radio mode or in optical wavelengths. They're looking for tumbling motions, like is the object tumbling, so it's going sort of bright, dark at very consistent timelines. They're looking for, so they can determine with consistent radar data, they can determine size, shape, characteristics. And the reason we don't know a lot about SOI identification because obviously it's highly classified. But one thing that is interesting, I was able to get some really interesting I suppose descriptors or narratives from an old document that it comes from a missile warning squadron in Florida that has a similar radar system to the ballistic missile early warning systems. Now, what this is down in Florida, there's an Air Force base called Eglin Air Force Base, and nearby there's a huge radar. It's one of the most powerful radars in the world. It's called the C6 site, and it's a US Air Force radar site. It's been variously operated by over the years. It's been around since 1968, and it's been variously operated by the 20th Surveillance Squadron, the 20th Missile Warning Squadron, the 20th Space Surveillance Squadron, and so on. Now, like the ballistic missile early warning system, the Eglin site also does, as its primary mission, it does missile warning, like missile object warning, like radar detection of missiles, and it also does space object identification or space surveillance. And I've got some a friend of mine, a colleague of mine in Britain, actually was able to get a document. It's called a unit history, and he was able to get a unit history from the 20th Missile Warning Squadron. A unit history is a document that describes the history, the mission, the budget, the manpower and personnel requirements, significant events, visiting dignitaries, awards and promotions, health and safety incidences, evacuations, and so on by any squadron or battalion or wing or whatever of any US Air Force or US Army unit. And anyway, so a unit history, this particular unit history that we got out of the US Air Force, it's called History of the 20th Missile Warning Squadron, 1st of October to 31st of December 1981. And in this, so like I say, we don't have much about operational. We don't have much on the record about operational space object identification, because it's highly classified. It's very, very specific. It's very hard to understand, and most people just aren't interested. They should be. UFO researchers should be exceedingly interested in this, but most aren't. Anyway, within this particular unit history, there was a couple of passages about space object identification at Eglin Air Force Base, and I'll read you two of them. One of them, it says, the space object identification technician was responsible for using radar information to define what a space object was and what it looked like. Each object and each part of an object had certain radar returns which the technician could translate into a description of the object. Right, that's the first sentence. Another sentence on the same page says, the signals analysis system was used to analyse returns from the radar for characteristics of space objects, including shape, width, length, height, etc. The SOI technicians use this information to identify space objects. So what this is saying is right back in 1981, which is nearly 40 years ago, they're using 1970s computers and technologies in 1981. Right, even back then, their technicians and their computer output systems are able to seriously use incoming data to ascertain a full description of objects in space, right? And presumably in missile warning mode, they were able to ascertain the shape and size of missile warheads. Like, I mean, it actually says, literally says here, this was incredible to me, that in 1981, it actually says here, they're looking for characteristics of space objects, like I said, including shape, width, length, height, etc. So if that's in 1981, can you imagine what the capabilities are like now?
Exactly, yes. I was just looking up also a little bit about SOI today, and I see contracts that get awarded for it on the web. One was just a few dollars shy of $100,000. The agency was Department of Defense branch, of course, Air Force, and that amount awarded to that program was $100,000 for SOI. For a certain year. But yes, of course, any government would be acutely interested in following anything in space. So I can imagine how acutely interested you people who research the topic of UFOs should be. And they should take heed regarding what you're saying. Wanted to ask you if there's any more on the ballistic early missile warning system you wanted to cover at all.
Absolutely, hopes. I mean, there is just so much here. I'll give you an example of potentially how important this is. The ballistic missile early warning system, which, like I've said, is in Alaska, Greenland, and England. They don't just. So they are constantly searching for missile launchers and missile bodies, like missile nuclear warheads or conventional warheads. And like I said, in secondary operational mode, they're searching for, or they're characterizing and identifying every object in space that passes overhead. Right now, they don't just sit on this data and then alert authorities that crikey, we've got missiles coming towards us. There is a massive stream chain of command, and what actually happens is that with all that data, so all that data is constantly coming in, right? That data, it goes in the UK. that data, or at least at the Royal Air Force Farlingdales site in the UK, the ballistic missile early warning radar data, in the UK it goes to a place called the Space Operations Coordination Centre, and it also goes to another facility called the Satellite Warning Service. Now, in America, things get more complicated. The data... The data from RAF Farlingdales and its systems goes to the Joint Functional Component Center for Space, and specifically within that center, which is at Vandenberg in California, the actual building the data goes to is the Joint Space Operations Center. Now, from there's different customers. So some process data from ballistic missile early warning system at Farlingdales, like I said, it comes through the Vandenberg site. Some of the data gets forwarded onto NORAD's Missile Warning Center at Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado. Some goes to NASA. Some goes to US Strategic Command in Nebraska. In Nebraska. Now, this is really important because, you know, if somewhere like RAF Farlingdales itself or any of the ballistic missile early warning system sites, if they won't release, you know, space object or missile object or what you could call UFO data, like UFO detections and reports, if they won't release it, then any of these other sites might. So I mean, it's a bit like if you write a letter to someone and you won't give me a copy of the letter, maybe I can go to the person who you wrote it to and they'll give me a copy. So I've identified, you know, a good 15 places or facilities or squadrons around the world where RAF Farlingdales missile and object warning data goes to, and I'm in the process of FOIing all them as well. So I've FOI'd Air Force Space Command, I've FOI'd NORAD, which is nearly impossible to do, and I'll give you an example of how difficult, incredibly difficult. This is a really sensitive issue, and the reason I'll give you an example of how difficult it is back in the 80s. One of the organisations that actually received ballistic missile early warning data from RAF Farlingdales, it was a small squadron. Back then there was an old US Space Command, and it was co-located with the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. It was co-located at Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, right? So in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, you had NORAD on one side of the room and you had Space Command on the other side of the room, and both of them, they both had a joint squadron. It was called the First Command and Control Squadron, or 1CACS, right? And 1CACS, their software and hardware, they received, you know, we'll call it UFO data or missile or a space object data. They received that sort of data from all over the world, including from RAF Farlingdales in England. And they must have, my understanding of 1CACS was a squadron that lasted for 11 years. My understanding is that they must have produced hundreds of thousands or millions and millions of pages of records, space object identification reports, missile alerts, missile false alerts, update reports, manpower and personnel requirements, system outages, display configurations, actual images of objects in space or whatever. And if this squadron, if 1CACS alone, just 1CACS alone, this little squadron, if they produce hundreds of thousands of records, millions of pages of records, files, special object assessments, special staff studies. I've worked out, you know, the sort of documentation that this squadron produced. There was you know, astrological studies and special analysis point papers and space object identification requirements lists and whatever, you know, and so far I've identified there is, in all those years of history at 1CACS, in all those years, the US Air Force or NORAD or whatever has only released one single file. So in other words, this squadron, which, like I say, must have produced an enormous amount of stuff on what essentially are UFOs, even if they are all just missiles and satellites and stuff, but they must have produced millions of pages of stuff. And yet they only have ever released one single page of record, and that happened to be a fact sheet. It was called Air Force Space Command Mission Directive, Organisation Mission Field, 1CACS. That's all they've ever produced. Like, that's all they've ever released under FOI. Extraordinary. So I'm in the process of going to NORAD and US Stratcom to release old 1CAX records, and it is proving impossible. They simply will not release anything. They pretend they can't find it. They pretend they don't know where it's housed. They pretend to not know what the squadron ever actually was, even though it was responsible for frontline early warning for the Western world, for space object and missile warning. They are simply not playing ball. I mean, this is going to be a very, very long affair.
I see. I wanted to bring up something a little random, and that is in 2001, and by the way, you're right, you really can't find anything on that topic at all except for what you just said. When I was doing just a little bit of research on the Flying Dales regarding the American radar stations over there, it said in this article done in 2001 that there was a controversial Star Wars program, as you know, and I'll just go ahead and read the paragraph to you regarding this 2001 article. There have been American radar stations at Flying Dales and Menwith Hill for years scanning the skies for hostile missiles. They've never attracted much criticism, but recently they've changed in appearance. Surely this can mean only one thing. They will play a central role in the U.S. president's controversial Star Wars strategy. Now, it's not just the people of North Yorkshire who are worrying. I wanted to know, did you ever hear about that topic?
No. I mean, I've looked a lot. I've mostly looked into the history and the actual capabilities of the site, but no, I mean, there is so much out there that's very, very generalized. And yeah, I mean, like, it is definitely a political issue. I mean, the RAF Fylingdales site, as part of the wider and growing new US Space Command network, it is a frontline site. I mean, it's been discussed in Britain's Parliament a lot, like how it should be funded, the possibility for protests and terrorism at the site and so on. But no, specifically what you've said, I haven't touched that. But I mean, there's a lot. There's a heck of a lot out there.
Well, it also goes on to say that culturally, the Flying Dales have never become unacceptable to Britons in general. Do you know what that means? Is that true?
I don't know. I mean, I know that the would be, I don't know.
It sounds like it was politicized a little bit.
Yeah, probably.
Anyway, do you think in the future there might be, more files, or do you think you might have to hold your breath on that regarding that?
There's going to be absolutely phenomenal number of files, but we're going to be holding our breath for years. Like the chances of us getting anything out of NORAD, whether it's historical or current. See,
right.
Currently, the ballistic missile early warning system, like I said, the data goes both to US Air Force and to Britain's space and missile warning cells, and certainly in the US Air Force, the actual controlling wing of the three ballistic missile early warning system sites, the controlling wing is the 21st Space Wing, and the actual group underneath that is the 21st Operations Group. Now, to get anything out of the 21st Operations Group about capability, radar detection, special studies, anything highly classified, it's going to be nearly impossible. But there is a possibility if FOI laws relax a lot, or if there's any historical data that's deemed to be worth, that it's not particularly sensitive. I mean, eventually they will release it, but it's going to take a lot of letter writing. It's going to take a lot of archival searching. It's going to be really difficult.
During a show with Christian Lambright, who is a very good friend of yours, I touched upon the topic, just wanted to bring up a random subject here, regarding FOIAs and how, an individual dedicated to requesting FOIAs from any government around the world can run into some extreme challenges. And actually, on the National Security Archives website, they talk about that topic. On that website, they talk about a 25-year-old FOIA request. That confirmed a FOIA delay continues unabated, meaning it's basically an argument that's happened for years, where people will ask ad nauseum what happened to my FOIA for 25 years. and they're basically ignored. And then it says here in this National Security Archives article, it says the key driver for FOIA requests that could be. It's actually a strange article. I'm going to have to read a paragraph
Sure.
before it so it can actually make sense, because again, it's very strange the way they talk in this article. So the first paragraph I'm going to read here is the archive audit team parsed through the annual FOIA reports federal agencies are required to submit to the Department of Justice's Office on Information Policy, and found that while many agencies appear to have used new reporting requirements as a tool to address the oldest agency's FOIA requests, others have let decades-old requests linger. The archive used the fiscal year 2017 reports because they were the most comprehensive collection available at the time of publication due to the delay caused by government shutdown, and will update this posting once a complete set of FY 2018 reports are available. And then it gets a little strange here. It says the key driver for FOIA requests that could be renting cars by now and growing backlogs, there must be a spelling error there, is the referral black hole, is what it's called. Agencies currently refer or consult on any FOIA request in which it feels another agency or agencies may possibly claim ownership of or equity in the information within the records. This daisy chain of referrals can result often in decades-long delay, and the review of the same document by multiple agencies is redundant, costly, and inefficient. I guess it doesn't really shock you
No.
that how ineffective, inefficient, and apathetic the U.S. government, probably the UK government, I'm guessing you'll have to confirm that,
Oh yeah.
how they react to a person who typically is dedicated to FOIA requests, and they get kind of a non-response, or when they do get a response, it puts them, it forces a person like you into a circular conversation with them. So I was going to ask you, statistically, just a guess on your part, in your lifetime of requesting FOIAs from any government, how often do you get stonewalled on it?
All the time. All the time. I can give you so many examples. We could be here till midnight.
But would you say 50% of the time,
At least.
100%?
For America, when I'm requesting military and to a lesser extent intelligence material, but particularly operational military material or administrative material, it is so common, probably above 50% of the time, the agency that I request information from will consult with 2, 3, 4, 5 other agencies at different layerings of government. So, for example, let's say I ask for certain records from the 11th Tactical Control Group in Alaska, right? Which is those records are controlled by the United States Air Force's Alaska Air Region. Fine, simple. That's one organisation within another organisation. That's fine. Okay. Then they'll come back to me and say, "Hold on, we've got to consult with Pacific Air Force Headquarters. We've got to consult with Pacific Command. We've got to consult with NORAD's Alaskan Air Region. Got to say the 25th Air Division at McCord Air Force Base. We've got to consult with, let's see, who else would, maybe if it's an old document, whoever inherited Air Force Systems Command documents, so that would be the Air Force Materials Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and so on. So you get this situation where you ask for, the documents, you ask for documents within a particular squadron or wing, or within, say, an intelligence community document, like, say, the Directorate of Science and Technology within the CIA, and all of a sudden they say, well, that's all right, we might want to release these records, that's fine, but we've got to consult with the NSA, we've got to consult with, INSCOM Army Intelligence, we've got to consult with Air Force Systems Command or whatever. It happens all the time, and it's very, very, very slow. Like I've seen this many times. I mean, even with all this Fylingdale stuff, I've been asking the British government for RAF Fylingdale's material. I've been asking them for a long time, and even, I mean, they're not going to release actual object data, but aside from that, they're not going to release anything anyway, because RAF Fylingdales is an international site. Like it's I mean, I've got a statement here that discusses how in another request that I did for RAF Fylingdale's doctrinal, I wasn't asking for actual space object identification records. I was asking for administrative material from the British government, and they simply came back and they said that being a joint British and US site, they've said here, having reviewed the information held, it is evident that the information requested may fall within the scope of international relations exemptions 27.1a, 27.2 and 27.3. These exemptions require us to conduct a public interest tests, blah, 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 blah. So, they're basically saying that here they've got another sentence that says these documents contain information affecting the national defence of the United States, within the meaning of the espionage laws, blah 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 blah. So even if you find something, even if you want some fairly specific documents, in a case of, say, the case of RAF Fylingdales, it's even harder because they've got to go through international bodies like the US Air Force. So this happens all the time. To answer your question, I'm not surprised at all.
So I wanted to ask you another question. So let me preface my question with kind of how you summarized it now. I'm going to bring up some points that you made, and then I'll ask my question. And a few points you made, and then I'll maybe add in one of my own. There's possibly or potentially endless paperwork and red tape, a lack of decision-making ability. I'm talking on behalf of the governments you're asking regarding FOIAs.
Sure.
Seemingly useless policies. Possibly lack of transparency, which is why you're asking for the FOIAs in the first place.
Sure.
And all of that can be a blessing and a curse, mostly a curse. Is how does a person deal with it psychologically?
Oh boy, patience. Absolutely enormous amounts of patience. You've got to, one of them, you've got to have great record keeping. So you've got to keep copies of all the FOIs you've sent out, all the appeals you've made. But psychologically, you've got to be patient. You're in it for the long haul. I mean, in Australia, we're much luckier here. For the Department of Defence anyway, our FOI system is totally centralised for the Department of Defence. That's Army, Air Force, Navy, and then top echelon records like the Minister of Defence and whatever. It's all centralised. So here it's quite easy. It's much easier. But for the United States and even the United Kingdom, you've got to be incredibly patient. You've got to read the FOI Act. Like if you can stomach it, you've got to read the laws. It's really advantageous to read the results of other FOI requesters' work, like journalists' work and researchers' work and university professors' studies and so on. You've got to read other people. You wouldn't just go in just blasting out FOI requests if other people had already done the same stuff. So you've got to do a mixture of research and you've got to have a lot of patience. Yeah.
So, and we all know you have an immense amount of patience and you're not afraid of hearing no, because obviously you wouldn't have been asking for FOIAs all these years later. Now, I wanted to bring up another FOIA topic, if you don't mind. And I'll go ahead and preface again with a little bit of information. Mainstream media, like, for example, let's just say the New York Times, they have deep pockets. So if they need to go ahead and create a lawsuit regarding a FOIA request, they probably can do that. No problem. Yep. But an individual like yourself who does all of this for free, you don't get paid a dime for what you do. This is all volunteer based, and you work just as hard, if not harder, than most people regarding FOIA requests. And you're just utterly dedicated to that exercise of requesting information for transparency's sake. What do you do when you realize that you're dealing with a flawed decision? In other words, let's say you get a letter back, or one of many, indicating that you don't have the right for information you're asking, but you know you do, and you don't have the money to create a lawsuit to force that agency or agencies to give that information that rightfully should be given. What do you do?
That's a good question. There's a couple of things you can do. One, you can appeal it. Any FOI decision where they come back and they say we have no records, or we have records but we can't find them, or we need more time and we need even more time and whatever, you can appeal it. And that can sometimes yield records or yield further information that you didn't know before, like where the records are physically kept or where they used to be physically kept or whatever. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is ultimately all records eventually are truly archived and go somewhere. That's on microfiche, hard drive, physical files in manila folders, whatever. They ultimately are either destroyed or they have to go somewhere. So in the case of the United States, old US Air Force files or US Navy files or whatever, they can go to the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. They can go to the Naval War College. They might go to Maxwell Air Force Base's Air Force Historical Research Agency. They might go to the Federal Records Center of St. Louis. One thing you can do is try and speed that up. So let's say you ask for records from 1983 records, and let's say US Strategic Command comes back and says, well, we've found some of the records you want, the rest we can't find, but we're going to knock you back, blah, blah, blah. What you can do, you can then go to the National Archives or the Air Force Historical Research Agency or whatever, and you can say to them, hey, look, I've just done some FOI work with US Stratcom. They've got some records which really you should have by now because they're still sitting on them in their libraries and in their big vaults. And, shouldn't they be requested centrally by now because they're so old? So basically, all records eventually, or most records should eventually go to big archival centres. They should be declassified, usually declassified, and go to big archival centres. And you can see if you can speed that up by saying, well, guys, you shouldn't actually still have these records anyway. They're 40 years old. Maybe you should sequester them and literally send them to the National Archives or the Space Museum or whatever. But even that is, of course, very slow. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is possibly find out, let's say there's some records that they refuse to release or pretend they don't have. You can see if possibly in the past anyone else has got those records out. So I know an author who's actually recently died. He's a very famous aerospace and space historian. His name was Jeffrey T. Richardson, and he wrote a lot of books on space satellites, space object detection, the Army, the history of the CIA, etc. He was a really brilliant guy, and I had a fair bit to do with him via email, usually, sometimes on the phone. But anyway, Jeffrey T. Richardson, he managed back in the 80s and 90s to get a heck of a lot of records out of the US Air Force and the US Navy and the US Army. And these records now, they can't find them, or they say they're too highly classified or whatever, but he actually got them out. And I was able, before he died, I was able to actually track down where his records were. And his research assistant, Jennifer Rimmer, actually sent me some of the most important records I've ever seen. They were squadron and wing-based administrative and command records. They were instructions, manuals, regulations from Air Division and Aerospace, echelon level of the US Air Force. What other records were there? Fact sheets and chart books, memorandums of understanding between space agencies. They were records on the actual physical capabilities of radar sites and optical telescope sites scattered across the United States. All sorts all sorts of records that I would have thought would now be classified, but back in the 80s they weren't particularly interesting, which is ironic. You'd think it'd be the other way around, but no. But the very records that Jeffrey T. Richardson got out in the 80s and 90s are records they either can't find at the moment or they consider to be too sensitive. And he somehow managed to get them out because he was an excellent researcher. He was a very, very dogmatic researcher. He had a bit of funding from universities as well, and he wrote very, very popular books. So he had a lot more clout than I do. I mean, I'm stuck in Australia as an individual researcher. He had a whole organisation behind him. And then to have a research assistant like Jennifer, who helped me out no end when I started asking Jeffrey for scanned materials, was fantastic. So sometimes you've got to look back into the past and see what other people have managed to get out of government agencies, but it's very slow. You've got to read a lot of books, a lot of magazines, and yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to also bring up an interesting topic, if you don't mind touching on it just a little bit, and that is you'll see where I'm going with this. It's still related to the FOIA topic. Richard Doty, you wrote a wonderful article regarding this on UFOs documenting the evidence. Was in June of 2018, and the title of it is finally, Richard C. Doty's United States Air Force Service Records. Well, nearly. And wanted to ask you a question about that before you cover that just a little bit. And that is it true that when, if FOIA requests were put forth regarding Richard Doty, do you believe it's possible that the agency or agencies that released the documentation on Doty accidentally gave too much information?
Yes, I do. I was stunned.
Before you answer that, I want to ask you, if they gave too much information, do you secretly believe it's possible it's because the individual or individuals that granted those documents did not know what they were doing?
I have thought about this quite a bit. It's a good question. I can tell you this right now, the Richard Doty records, I didn't obviously get them out. What actually happened was researcher Larry Bryant, he actually wrote a number of FOI requests to, I think it was it was one of the airbase wings and one of the AFOSI detachments and one of the administrative squadrons at Kirkland Air Force Base and Bowling Air Force Base headquarters, AFOSI and so on. He wrote a few FOI requests and he got this sort of mixed, sort of dissimilar batch of records, particularly quite old records on Richard Doty, Staff Sergeant Richard Doty. He got all this stuff out. Look, there was a good, I can't remember, 40 pages or something, 30 pages. And I can tell you two things. I can tell you now, if someone like me or whatever tried that now, there is every chance that they would not release them because we've got the Privacy Act now. I mean, back in 1988 when Larry Bryant got that material released, the Privacy Act was much weaker than what it is now. Now it's very, very strong. Everyone's hypnotised by this Privacy Act. Everyone's terrified to release anything on anyone's privacy. And those records are quite specific. I mean, those Richard Doty records, they discuss what sort of tickets he had, like courses, qualifications, what sort of aptitude testing he was doing, his exact places of tours of duty, right down to specific dates, the names of various students going through courses that were with him, addresses, all this sort of stuff. It was quite an eye opener, and but I can tell you right now that there is no way, almost no way, that a FOSI or Kirkland Air Force Base's administrative airbase wings records would be released now. They may be released, but with huge redactions, like massive pages of black ink all over them. And to answer the other bit of the question, the person who released them to Larry Bryant, it would be nice to think that they and there's a possibility that they released them because they knew exactly what they were doing, because Doty was then somewhat well known in media circles and in UFO community. But probably more likely the person who released those documents and redacted some of them was simply rushed. They were, maybe a lot of personnel records were being released at the time, and this was just another batch. Who knows? I don't know. Larry Bryant would know, but that release was in 1988, which is I guess, some 30 years ago or so. So I wouldn't mind seeing what else. What I mean, they must have had a lot of material that they didn't release in the form of probably quite dry stuff like. Like applications for annual leave and sickness reports and like medical incidences and occupational health and safety. And every time in the US Air Force, every time you fall over, every time you put a Band-Aid on, every time you come late for work, every time you're suspected of being under the influence of alcohol, every time, you fail to appear at a meeting or fail to write down, it's so much is recorded, and some of that material will be very dry and probably destroyed by now, and some won't be. I don't know. I never heard from Richard Doty on that. When I released that stuff, I don't know why Larry Bryant didn't release it years ago, and I don't know why. When I released that stuff on my blog and put it out, I would have thought Richard Doty himself would actually sort of say something to me, because I have spoken to him before, but he never did. So either he didn't care, or he thought it was a bit of a laugh, or maybe he was annoyed but just couldn't do anything about it. FOI is a funny beast. It's strange.
Wanted to bring up just a little bit on Larry Bryant, who kind of stays under the radar. He's not a person who seeks attention, as you know, but he has been prolific as a writer and a researcher dedicated to his UFO blog, which he kept for many years. And I'm just going to read a little bit on him that's just kind of interesting. I actually wrote an article regarding the CIA archives, so I'm just going to read a little bit from that article on Larry Bryant. A well-known researcher of ufology who ended up in the CIA archives was writer Larry W. Bryant. His strange court case and application has been filed in court here, demanding that the Air Force release the remains of the extraterrestrial being or beings it alleged to be holding in secret custody. Pentagon officials said today. That's a really old article, by the way. And this curious article written for Reuters, published in July 14th, 1983, details an alleged abduction of extraterrestrial creatures by the U.S. government. Mr. Bryant was a former director for the Washington, D.C. Office of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. He was also a civilian federal employee for over 30 years. Bryant has researched the area of ufology for many years from his home in Alexandria, Virginia. He has published hundreds of articles. These reports, I believe it's actually thousands, but anyway, these reports range from personal to long sought after FOIA requests. His other reports are empirical and investigative research regarding ufology and ET subject matters. Mr. Bryant has an extensive blog, which can be found on Tumblr. That article goes on to detail the extraordinary case regarding ETs in the U.S. military, which can be found in the CIA archives. Wanted to ask you, fellow researcher Larry Bryant, what do you think gave him the impetus to ask for any kind of FOIA-related records on Doty?
Because he was a prolific FOI requester, for one. It would be absolutely no surprise that, he wouldn't have been the only one. Richard Doty's name and myth as being an AFOSI counterintelligence or intelligence officer was well known by the late 80s. His role in the so-called Benowitz affair and UFOs at Kirkland Air Force Base and maybe at other sites had been well known by then. Doty was extremely well known to researchers like Lee Graham and Bill Moore. So, Larry Bryant as a researcher was already well in the 80s, was already submitting FOI requests and doing general archival searching. So I don't know what particular impetus or stimulus he got to FOI, FOSI, or anyone else on Richard Doty especially. But it would be unthinkable that someone wouldn't, and just he happened to be the guy.
Well, thank you very much for having covered that topic. It's fascinating. Also wanted to bring up an interesting topic that we were talking about before the show, and that is oddball UFO researcher Armin Victorian from the 1990s. Can you talk a little bit about that topic?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So like I was saying, oh boy, so the RAF Fylingdales mission which is the ballistic missile early warning, missile detection, and space object detection mission in England. Over the years, it has reported variously to NORAD, Aerospace Defense Command, the old US Space Command, 14th Air Force, and so on, right? So the ballistic missile early warning system, the three sites make up a small portion of what we call the US government's Space Surveillance Network, SSN. So the Space Surveillance Network in the 90s, for example, was made up of 22 space surveillance sites. The ballistic missile early warning system sites were just 3 of them. There was another, 19 or whatever. Now, the entire SSN network, the entire space surveillance network, back in the 90s, it was the entire thing was functionally and operationally governed by a huge document, an absolutely vital document, classified secret. It was called US Space Command Regulation 55-12, Operations Space Surveillance Network SSN. Right? That's what the document was called. Now, back in and that was the particular version of the document we've got was published on the 1st of June 1992. It was classified by multiple sources as secret, and it's a 200-page document. Anyway, back in the 1990s, some listeners may remember that there was a curious, very unusual researcher in England by the name of Dr. Armin Victorian. Right? Some people will not know who the hell I'm talking about, and some people will shake their heads and say, oh boy, this guy. So Armin Victorian was really bizarre. So Armin he was born in Soviet Armenia in the 60s. He fled Soviet Armenia for Iran in the 70s. His actual real name was Habib Azadadel. He fled Iran to the United Kingdom sometime in, I think, about 1979. He changed his name to Henry Azadadel. Then he decided he was interested in 2 things. He was interested in orchids, as in the plants, like flowers, and he was interested in UFOs. And he was very, very good at both of them. Armin Victorian started flooding. He called himself Dr. Armin Victorian. He also went under other names like Colin Baker, Cassava Natumba, if you can believe that, an African name. He started flooding the British Defence industrial complex and the US's, like America's military, started flooding them with FOI requests. And he was so dogmatic, he was so clever and so determined, and he just came along at the right time when FOI laws were quite lax. And he started flooding them with FOI requests, and he actually got some incredible results. He was the first person to identify John Alexander as being part of a so-called non-lethal weapons testing and non-lethal weapons and psychic warfare development within the Army. He was the first person to associate so-called OPREP 3 reports with UFOs. So OPREP 3 reports are a type of reporting within the US Air Force's reporting network that officers can use to report UFOs, and indeed have. Armin Victorian was also the first person to identify the proper name for an unknown object in space. And that unknown object in space, the proper term is an uncorrelated target. Right? A UCT, uncorrelated target. The way he did that was in 1992, Armin Victorian asked US Space Command's Public Relations and FOI desk, he asked them for a copy of that document I just read out before. He'd obviously seen it somewhere. He's seen a reference to it. It's, like I said, it was called US Space Command Regulation 55-12, Operation Space Surveillance Network, SSN, classified secret. Armin asked them for a copy, and amazingly, they gave it to him. There were redactions. We do have a copy of Armin Victorian's copy. We do have a copy. It's full of redactions. It's all about unidentified object detection in space, uncorrelated targets in space, the criticality of unidentified objects in space, how to process them through the system, how to draw them or write them down, how to store radar data, how to report unknown objects in space to NORAD and US Space Command headquarters from the individual space detection facilities, how to keep NASA in the loop, and so on. It's 200-page document. Anyway, within there on the very, very first page, one of the things that it offers, it basically says that the entire space surveillance network is under the purview of US Space Command and NORAD, except one site, and that site is RAF Filingdales. And that's what gave me the idea originally, really, to FOI RAF Filingdales. So on the front page, so it was really Armin Victorian's work in the 90s, which gave me the idea to harass the Ministry of Defence for their documents on RAF Filingdales, because what it actually says on the front cover of US Space Command Regulation 55-12, it actually says, this regulation provides policy and guidance for operations of the Worldwide Space Surveillance Network, or SSN. It applies to Headquarters US Space Command, the component commands being Headquarters Air Force Space Command, Naval Space Command and Army Space Command, the Space Surveillance Centre and the Alternate Space Surveillance Centre, and the SSN sensor sites except RAF Filingdales. Then it says RAF Filing has, for an acronym, RAF Filingdales follows different guidance specified in SR 55 122/88771/7/GE bracket S close bracket Joint US Air Force Royal Air Force Operations Manual JOM Ballistic Missile Early Warning System Site 3 RAF England. So when I saw that years ago, I thought, hold on, this is cool. So RAF Filingdales England follows slightly different guidance than the rest of the Space Surveillance Network sites. So it was originally, that's what got me interested. And now I've asked for a copy of that document and they've knocked me back. The document still actually exists. It's actually changed its names a few times over the years. But so the RAF Filingdales operating manual, that still exists, but I've been knocked back for copies of that. And then further today, currently in the 2010s, I've asked US Stratcom for the old US Space Command 55-12 document, and they've knocked me back for that as well, even though they released it to Armin Victorian right back in the 90s. So, so it's just funny how a UFO researcher in England who wasn't English at all, he was Iranian, he stumbled across these documents and references to other documents, and we're still using them now as researchers, and we still can't get them out. Huh.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Armin Victorian, alias Henry Azadehedel. Is that how I say it?
Yeah,
alias Habib Azadehed. I can't even say it. Alias Henry X. I'm not even gonna bother. I'll just have a fit if I even bother trying to say those names. I'm sorry. Alias Kasaba and Tumba and many others. I'm sure. Yeah. Thank you. Also, apparently, allegedly an orchid smuggler, conspiracy theorist, and kind of a creepy all-around guy. Yes, Armenian ancestry, and allegedly a former operative of the Shah of Iran.
Yeah, that one's probably but go on. Yep, I can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know how verifiable that alleged statement is.
That last bit is not right, but I'll tell you what.
Okay. Yeah.
So I know a fair bit about this guy. It's really bizarre because he just came into the field. He was indeed an orchid smuggler. He actually went to the Philippines and other places. Well, put it this way, look, you can believe the myth that he was an orchid smuggler, right? But it turns out it's actually true, because not once but twice he was actually hauled up in court at the Old Bailey in London, on orchid smuggling charges. And he actually did go to jail. Now, I think it was a suspended sentence, which means he would have been put under house arrest because the jails are full. But the point is, he actually was charged and convicted of orchid smuggling. I think there were 3 charges. One was dropped, but the other 2 stood up. The other thing about him is that over the years, look, there are people that remember him and who actually do know him or did know him. And he actually also was busted on phone tapping. So it wasn't so much phone tapping; it was more he was actually getting free international phone calls by mucking around with the telephone lines in the street. So he was basically making international telephone calls around the world, but someone else was getting the bill, or British Telecom was having to pay for it. It was funny because Boston-based researcher Barry Greenwood used to talk to him quite a lot on the phone, and Barry said to me once, Barry didn't know all this phone tapping or phone hijacking stuff, but Barry said to me once, years ago, he said to me, I never really understood how Armin could afford so many phone calls to me in Boston. Because back in the 90s, international phone calls were very expensive, and especially in peak times. And Barry said to me, "Yeah, I don't know how he afforded these phone calls 3 times a week to all of us." And I said, "Well, don't you know about the phone tapping charges?" And yeah, but someone else I know who knew Armin Victorian said, "Now this is interesting," said he had suitcases full of international money. So he had suitcases full of Iranian and Italian and British money. And he also had multiple passports. So he had fake passports. He had passports that were issued. He had an Italian passport that was issued in Rome. He had an Iranian passport, which maybe is not so surprising. And he also had a British passport, which shouldn't really mix. So he definitely, look, at best there is a possibility. I have heard that there was a possibility he actually worked for the Iranian embassy in England as kind of like a bit of a spy, like not so much spying on the British government or the British civilians or whatever, but actually spying on embassy staff. So the Iranian embassy in London has always been fraught with problems. Iranian embassy has always had its diplomats, smoking drugs and gambling and carrying on. And I have heard via the grapevine that Armin was employed by the Iranian government to keep some of the office workers at the Iranian embassy in London in check, basically see what they're up to, if they're even turning up for work, that sort of thing. But look, I don't know if that's true, but the fact of the matter is he did. Yep.
He's kind of obviously an eccentric guy, to say the least, who apparently had a very strange grocery list of goals. And included on that bizarre list of goals was ufology. Why do you think he even cared about that topic so much? Apparently, he pursued it relentlessly.
Yes, he did.
I'm sure he had thousands and thousands of documents on that topic. So I'm wondering what happened to all those documents, who his family was, and where did that estate, that UFO archive estate, go?
And this is something that I've been instrumental in trying to track down, and so is Isaac Coy in England, and a few of us has. It's really important. Grant Cameron's interested too. Basically, what happened is, this is really weird. I mean, the guy, like I said, the guy had multiple passports. He had multiple. Certainly had money from different countries. He possibly worked for the Iranian. He was interested in mind control, psychic warfare, UFOs, crashed UFOs, UFO retrieval, NORAD space detection, US Space Command space detection, whatever, an orchid smuggler to top it off, a phone tapper. And all of a sudden, what's really bizarre is in 1997, he just disappeared. Right? No one heard from him again. No one, as far as I can tell, Barry Greenwood, Brad Sparks, Jan Aldridge, Aaron Cameron, nobody heard from him. All of a sudden, in 1997, he just disappeared. And there was some indication he crime any records of that, though. He could have simply lost interest in the topic or been to the United Kingdom, sent back to around places. I found someone called Armin Victorian, and certainly some of the things he had written back years ago on Twitter certainly somewhat fitted him. So what I did, I joined up to Twitter, and I actually sort of personally messaged this account, and 18 months later, so what, 2 years ago? Yeah, 2 years ago, 18 months later, this Armin Victorian on Twitter actually wrote back to me and said, "Yes, I'm Armin Victorian." And I said, "I really want to get your email address. I want to ask you a few questions." So he gave me an email address. It was a really unusual email address, but I emailed it, and then a few days later he wrote back. And I won't repeat what he wrote because it's, one, I haven't got it in front of me, and two, it was just so bizarre. He wrote really what you would call almost paranoid religious fanaticism. I mean, I can't remember what he wrote word for word, but he talked about aliens being here for thousands of years. He talked about, he talked about ancient civilizations. He talked about God. He talked about the devil. Whatever. Yeah. It was really bizarre. I mean, it was one of the most whacked out and almost fanatic. It was fanatical. It was bizarre.
I'm just laughing because it's an interesting response back.
Yeah. Look, I don't even know if it was him. I don't know if it was him. Right. To this day, I do. The email address means nothing. It's just a bizarre email address. Well, I actually forwarded that email to people that knew Armin in the 80s and 90s, and they said, "Look, personally, I just don't think it's him." Barry Greenwood. I remember Barry Greenwood came back to me because Barry had a lot to do with Armin Victorian. Barry Greenwood came back to me and said, "Look, Armin was always quite flowery in his language, but never this bad."
Well,
So
okay.
I
So
don't
do
know.
you think it's just possible
It's
that
quite-
he may have, hear me out on this. I use this term loosely, by the way, mental illness.
oh,
Do
you,
you think it's possible that he succumbed to a form of mental illness that caused him to have word salad and rant, and maybe his emotional IQ and his response compromised his ability to have um, more comprehensive and crystal clear conversation with you?
absolutely no question about it. Listen, either there's one of the possibilities with the Twitter account and the emails and what, because anyone can make up a Twitter account called Armin Victorian. I mean, he
Well,
was a
yeah.
very, very well-known guy. I mean, he really was very well-known in UFO circles, well-known in rare plant species circles. He had a criminal record. He's had magazine articles written about him. What anyone could. Either I was dealing with a troll who wasn't him, who's God knows who, or it was actually him, and he has totally succumbed to paranoia and mental illness. I mean, like I said, what I got back in the form of that email was just absolutely bizarre. Now, look, I spoke to Nick Pope. Armin Victorian used to converse on the phone quite a bit with Nick Pope when Nick Pope was running the MOD's Air Secretary at A2S cell in London. Armin Victorian would commonly talk to Nick Pope. He would ring him on the phone, or he would send him in UFO reports that he'd gotten from somewhere. And Nick Pope always found him very strange. But every now and again, even Nick Pope admitted to me, he said every now and again, Armin would actually come out with something really interesting about UFOs that we didn't know. And but Nick found him very eccentric. I mean, most people did. He was also oh God, I don't know how much I can say. He was apparently fairly untrustworthy. He also used to record phone calls, so he would ring people and actually record the phone call without permission. He apparently did it all the time. Yeah, he did. Yep.
Was he also abrasive and very aggressive?
Somewhat, yes. He was very hyperactive.
Okay. Well, I did want to mention something about him, and that is, and then I have a question for you, and that's it about that topic. But apparently, a short film may have been made about him called The Mythologist. I think it was made by a gentleman by the name of John Lundberg, a 26-minute documentary, which was first broadcast on the BBC in 2004. What are your thoughts on that? And then also wanted to ask you again, because I know you got caught up on other topics, but where do you think the archive of his UFO data went?
Look, I asked him. Look, when I got his weird email, I wrote back I wanted to try and stay on topic. I mean, I didn't even know what to say to it, but I asked him where his material went, and he actually told me that, well, this person, if it was Armin Victorian or not, I will never know, but this person told me that he divided his UFO files up. So it'd be FOI requests, appeals, sighting reports, whatever, recorded phone interviews, whatever. He divided it up between two universities, one in England and one in America. And I thought, what the hell? What the hell's going on here? And I thought, well, okay, which university? So even if this is true, and even if this person is actually Armin Victorian, I thought to myself, what universities? There's thousands of them. And why? Why would you do that? And I wrote back to him and I said, which universities, which university in England and which university in America, please. Never heard a reply, never got a response. So I just don't know what's going on. But his material would be really important. I mean, I know some of the FOI requests he did and got replies to. I know that he was the first person I know also to get a copy of what we call the Joint Chiefs of Staff Operational Reporting Manual, which includes a layout or a synopsis of OPREP 3 reporting, which can be used for UFOs. So obviously right back in that was in 1990 or so. So back in 1990, Armin Victorian had already ascertained that OPREP 3 reports were being used to report UFOs over military bases in the United States. So, I mean, I discovered that independently myself a few years ago, and then I found out that Armin had actually discovered it, 20 years before me. So, I mean, this guy's records will be really important. So where they are, I don't know. I know he's got a brother, but yeah.
And not only that, but it would probably be interesting to pore over his massive archive of UFO information if he actually was able to grab information that was top secret by mistake. Like if the government actually sent it by mistake, classified material, that would be interesting to read.
Oh, for
And
sure.
then also, I'm going to assume it's possible, since he was in the position he was, which was possibly a spy, that he may have had access to intelligence related data that might have been classified. What do you think about that?
I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised at all.
But does it strike you as strange that a spy, if he was that, would be filling out FOIA requests?
Anyone can do it. I mean, anyone.
Okay, yeah.
Anyone can fill out FOIA requests. That's no problem. Look, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, he just had a very strange lifestyle. Anyway, that mythologist movie, I was going to ask you, did you get a chance to actually watch that documentary?
I've never seen it. I can't get. I mean, I don't know anyone who's got a copy. I would love a copy, but I don't have one. I don't know how accurate it is. I mean, look, I've got to look into it a bit more. I want to ask Lundberg, and I think it was also helped along. The documentary was helped along by a guy called Marco Pinkleton, who's quite a good writer. I've got to look into that further. But it's like dealing with smoke and mirrors, because like. It's already hard enough that back then this guy was quite mysterious. So dealing with him now, or we just don't know. Like I would love to. But I don't even know how old he is. Like I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so we've exhausted that topic, but I did want to give a disclaimer to our audience, and that is, I don't think the possibility of anyone ever coming across classified material is going to be very often in their lifetime. But if that happens to you, just remember, there are laws. You will be prosecuted. You cannot publish information regarding that. And I know it sounds a little square to say, but if you come across any classified material, you need to report it to a proper U.S. agency immediately.
Yeah.
So anyway, wanted to really thank you for having gone over that interesting topic regarding Armin. He has a very colorful past, and I may have missed it. Did you say that he is deceased or not?
We don't know. I mean, if the guy that was emailing me is actually Armin Victorian, well, then he's not deceased. But I mean, if he is deceased, I don't know. I suppose we haven't really looked at death records or anything. He does have a brother, Basil Azadadel in London. I think I tried to get onto him, but his email address was 20 years old or something. But look, I don't know if he's dead. I don't know.
If anyone's listening and they're in London, or they have access to being able to find out death records, in any of the countries we just talked about, please contact Paul Dean. He's easy to contact. Is there an email that people can actually be allowed to have on air to contact you?
Yeah, of course. So it's all lowercase, PJ_DEAN@hotmail.com.
Yeah, and then also it's really important for people to know that you are an avid and active writer on the UFO topic and many other topics. You have UFOs-doc. In fact, I'll just mention your website. It's UFOs Documenting the Evidence at blogspot.com. But let me just go ahead and say that URL better. It's UFOs-documenting-the-evidence.blogspot.com. Now, easier way to find it is just type in UFOs Documenting the Evidence with Paul Dean's name after that, after you click search on Google, and it'll come up immediately. I wanted to ask you that you went over regarding the ballistic missile early warning topic. Are you going to be writing an article on that? If so, when can we anticipate?
Okay. As soon as possible. I've just got to finish it. I've written a very, very lengthy article. I've just got to finish it. It's 8,000 words already. So, it's got a lot of material in there. Sadly, there's one thing that is a problem is I've actually found that old Space Command records, which include ballistic missile early warning system records, unfortunately, a large amount of them have been destroyed, and I've got the right in front of me, I've got, as an example, I've got a US an old US from I think it was from 1991, an old US Air Force Directorate of Information Management file, which explains to the National Archive the sort of space surveillance and missile records that they'll be destroying in the future and not passing on, and some of them include missile warning records, space object identification, recordings of special interest, whatever that is, raw satellite data used and similar records used for trend analysis and anomaly resolution, and so on. And so these are the sort of records that even in the 1990s, the US Air Force wanted to destroy before, handing them over to more permanent sites like the National Archives. So that's a blow for FOI research. But I'll be writing about all this. I'll be publishing all this very soon.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for having talked about the ballistic missile early warning topic, along with the space object identification topic, and the RAF Flying Dales, and the missile warning mission, and the space surveillance mission, and then the Armin topic, the Armin Victorian topic. And he has too many aliases to mention here. But anyway, it's been a fascinating evening with you, and we always love having you on the show. Now, I wanted to mention to our listeners one last thing before we go here, and Paul has a few last things to say to wrap up, and that is tomorrow we will be interviewing close friends of actually Paul Dean, and those are veteran UFO researchers Christian Lambright, who is a former investigator for the Center of UFO Studies and a contributor to the Computer UFO Network. He holds a degree in psychology from Baylor University, has worked extensively in computer technology and internet services, and has a background in graphic arts and illustration. And then also Jan Aldrich. Since 1995, Mr. Aldrich has worked full-time in Project 1947, which is also a website. Additionally, it's a research effort funded by QFOS, FUFOR, and MUFON, now called the UFO Research Coalition. And Mr. Aldrich has visited over 150 libraries, universities, archives, museums, and historical societies in 46 states and Canadian provinces. And Jan delved into the MUFON UFO files when he visited Sequoia location. Move on. We'll be having
the constant discussion within UFO circles of the FBI and the CIA and the DIA and quasi-private organisations, and even to an extent. Some aspects of the Air Force, I think for FOI and documents and history research is becoming very, very tired, almost mythical. The exact places that we should be harassing and studying and researching and analysing the frontline object detection sites, whether it's objects in space or objects in the atmosphere. That's NORAD, Air Force Space Command, including especially the 21st Space Wing, the ballistic missile early warning sites, the GEO DSS sites, the naval space surveillance fence, the air traffic control towers of the Joint Surveillance System. It's these places that actually, let's not forget here, they detect, track, identify unknown or unusual or unexpected objects in the air or in space. I mean, isn't that what this is all about? Like constantly bashing on about how the FBI probably, monitor UFO researchers, and a FOSI or the Office of Air Force Special Investigation are interfering with, UFO researchers, and the big bad CIA and its secret UFO programs and all this. It's just, it's like all this time, as each year goes on, the frontline air defence units and the space surveillance wings and squadrons are, if they are detecting what we call UFOs, they're getting away with it red-handed, because we're not pressuring them at all. I mean, nobody I know is both, like in Australia with Australian Defence Department or the US's Defence Department. Virtually no one I know is, well, there's one person I know, my colleague David Carmichael, but other than him and me, virtually no one I know is consistently asking US Air Force wings and squadrons or, Northcom or Air Force Space Command, or no one's asking them for the sort of data and policy direction and plan statements and special analysis reports and capabilities. No one's asking them for the right documentation. And even when you can't ask them, even when it's classified or non-existent or whatever, like very few people are even reading the history of atmospheric warning and atmospheric detection and space warning and space objects. It's very, very complicated. True, but it does frustrate me when I see people banging on about, the Army's Horton brothers or, Betty and Barney Hill's abduction or whatever, just banging on for years and years and years, hypnotized by the CIA and absolutely hypnotized by the president's secret UFO meetings and all this trash that seeps into the UFO community like a poison dye. And no one's actually asking the very agencies that have the job of detecting UFOs. It baffles me. But anyway,
that's a very, very good point.
Hey, Paul, just some advice I give Chant once in a while. Don't complain about somebody else not doing something because it gives you the opportunity to do it. And what's going on?
Blasting away organizations.
I still think Paul Dean has a fantastic point there. And also, I think UFO researchers should take heed of that point and really understand that if they want to pursue that topic, the UFO topic, as aggressively and in a dedicated manner as they strive to, they need to really understand what you just said. And I'm glad you emphasized that. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's all right. That's awesome.
Well, thanks for having been on our show, Paul. We look forward to having you more on this year as we did last year. So we hope
thanks a lot, Paul. Evening. Appreciate it.
Stay
all right,
safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. And thanks, Paul. And as Chant mentioned, we will be back tomorrow. Anything on the way out there, Chant?
Yeah, I mentioned our show. I mentioned who we're going to have on, Christian Lambright and Jan Aldrich, veteran UFO researchers. I gave their bios, and that's it.
So when is this show that we just recorded? When is this show going online?
It's we're still recording right now, Paul. I haven't hit the stop recording.
Okay,
but I'll upload it.
Before you publish it, tell me. All right, I got to go. See ya.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's we'll wrap up, and the process usually goes. We do the recording, and then usually takes a couple 3 hours to upload and process.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good question too, because I get that question from folks in the UFO community when I announce in a post we're going to do a show. How long does it take? Frank's right. He's the person who does the publishing of the post, the talk show, and that takes about 3 or 4 hours to upload to YouTube. 2 to
3. It kind of depends on the length of the show. This one was reasonable at an hour 30. So good night, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your night. Enjoy your quarantine, and we will talk to you tomorrow because you're not going anywhere. Bye-bye.